Hey, warm up, brother, hello! Welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Seeps with myself, Greg Eeps Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. We've got an excellent podcast for you as we're going to be joined by one of our good friends, Rob Donaldson, for a little bit of a two-part chat. I know that he does such a great job of being able to take a look at the mid-majors of college basketball. We're certainly going to be diving in on some of those teams. I'm also going to ask him a little bit about some of the preparation he has for the upcoming season, some of the things that he looks for teams that he's looking to back and teams that he's looking to fade, as well as some of those just worry sort of signs, and how things are a little bit different now in this day and age for getting set for the upcoming college basketball season than it has been in past years as well. Going to be a nice wide-ranging chat, and it's going to be a two-part chat with him because we are frankly running out of college basketball news and notes. We might be getting NCAA expansion relatively soon, and I hope and pray that we don't, so we're going to be crossing our fingers and our toes on that one, but we don't have to do that with regards to knowing that you're going to get a podcast every single day, regular season and off season. And if you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Seeps, you're able to subscribe wherever your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. And if you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you do have one of two ways we'll fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, letters EM, they mean does not matter. So as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast by that 5-star review. And while I did not get in any Twitter/X questions today, everything is powered by EdgeBoost. EdgeBoost is doing an amazing job of making sure that bettors are able to access their funds anytime, anywhere. And when you go to edgeboost.bet, you utilize them and you get cashback rewards. And when you use the promo code of Greg when you sign up over at EdgeBoost, GREG, that gets you a dollar for dollar match on your first deposit of up to $25. Now let's chat with our good friend Rob Donaldson. He does such amazing work taking a look at this wonderful game of college basketball, and you're able to follow him on Twitter/X at RobDFB altogether. And Rob, it is great to get you aboard. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Greg. Always fun to talk college ball with you, especially when we're out of season and we're kind of yearning for it. And as you know, we continue to have these episodes or these appearances hopping on. I mean, we're getting closer and closer. It's starting to feel more and more real as we go on right now.
Oh, it certainly is. And just how do you evaluate this time of year? What are some of the things that you do look at in terms of getting your preparation all set for the upcoming season? Because now it feels like we know what these rosters are going to be. Now we don't have as many question marks with that regard, but now I think it's all about just being able to put, for lack of a better term, all the pieces together.
Yeah, the way that I do it anyway is I go conference by conference, and I kind of like to start from the mid-major level because I think that's where a lot of the betting value in terms of, maybe not the reason why I watch college basketball, but it's one of the bigger reasons why I watch college basketball is to make money. And honestly, the smaller conferences, the smaller schools, the smaller programs have the most kind of interesting storylines and year-over-year turnover. And I think right now there's a lot of conferences in that sphere that have kind of taken on a brand new identity in terms of the teams that are at the top.
Yep, I think that it is so well said by you because I do think that there's a lot of value with regards to these mid-majors. And what are some of the aspects that you look at with these mid-major teams that make them a team that you either want to back or fade?
Well, there's a lot of aspirations when you look at both the personnel and the coaching staff, right? I mean, there's guys who will go from the Big South, move up to the CAA, and then all of a sudden find themselves in the ACC. I think like a Pat Kelsey. And I think the aspirations of a coach, a guy who's hungry to carve out his sort of like land in this sphere and really prove himself, be more accomplished, make the big dollars. That's a huge motivating factor. And guess what? The players who are freshmen, sophomore, juniors in those mid-major levels, they want to be able to make their money in college basketball now too. And there's a short little window for them, a lot shorter than that as a coach. And so I feel like there's a lot of motivational angles, and it's really about buying into the teams that you feel like have not only just that skill, the talent, that raw talent to compete right away, but also are these guys, hungry to elevate their status within college basketball? I think that's a huge motivating factor there.
Yep, I think so as well. And I take a look at the CAA, which you mentioned a little bit earlier as well. And I think that that's such an interesting conference to be taking a look at because you've got a team in UNC Wilmington that they're bringing in just essentially so many players from within the conference. And we talk about these players going from like down a level with regards to competition, up a level of competition. You essentially had in this conference so many guys just changing hands. I think that makes it one of the most interesting conferences to evaluate.
Oh, 100%. And when you're talking about the talent accumulation, when we're talking about the coaches that make up this league, and even the programs where, yeah, maybe it's not the most jump out and hit you in the face sort of name programs, but there's a lot of success here. I mean, Charleston, Towson, UNC Wilmington, Hofstra, Drexel. These are all programs. Northeastern is another one. These are all programs that have carved out success, not only within the CAA, but outside of the CAA, so much so that those sort of brands are, difficult tasks when the better programs go up against them. And yeah, when you're talking about the actual battle within the conference, we got one of the best, I think, conference tournaments of the entire postseason this past year in the CAA tournament when Delaware went on a run, and I think that just kind of speaks to how fun this league really is.
And rest in peace to Delaware being in the CAA. They're now in Conference USA, which I didn't know that until I was doing my research for Conference USA, by the way. So if you're feeling a little bit confused about some of these teams that are moving conferences, well, have no fear because you're not alone. As Rob Donaldson, who does great work with the show/podcast Rob's Best Bets, is joining me on Coast to Coast Soups. And how do you take a look at the CAA? Because I do think that Delaware is going to be lost in the shuffle a little bit in that conference. But as we know, Liberty was able to have themselves a nice year. Louisiana Tech, year in and year out, is pretty rock solid. Middle Tennessee is pretty rock solid. It just felt like there were a lot of relatively solid teams in there. There was clearly that head and shoulders team of Liberty, but even a team like Jacksonville State last year was so intriguing too.
Yeah, the CAUSA is one of those leagues that unfortunately has kind of taken some hits over the years with a lot of like roster realignment and maybe teams like a Middle Tennessee State and a Western Kentucky not really playing up to that billing that they've established in the past. And we just talked about Delaware joining the CUSA. Missouri State is another one that's joining this offseason as well, and that's a program that I think is still trying to find its way back to where they were around 2018, 2019, 2020, when they really were near the top of the MVC with a lot of star-studded talent. And when you're looking at that league, man, I think there's a lot of different directions to go. I think the easiest, safest bet is obviously going to be on Liberty. It's just one of those, yeah, I can blindly bet on them, and they're going to figure out what to do with McKay. He just is always right there to win a lot of games every single season. But New Mexico State really showed a lot of promise in terms of how they defended towards the end of the year. The offense was sort of a wild card game by game, but that's still a program that has a lot of success out there in the West sort of side of the United States as well. And another team in that conference that I'm kind of willing to at least explore and view the upside on is a Sam Houston State, because they played a lot better near the back end of the season after a terrible, terrible start to the season. And those are some of the teams that I feel like actually end up giving you the most sort of value in terms of when the season starts anew.
Yep, no question about it. And I do think that this is going to be so interesting to take a look at the to take a look at CUSA for this upcoming season. And you said it, they have fallen on some tough times because they lost so many teams to the American. And I think that that's just another really interesting conference because you've had a lot of underachievers. Like I would think that Tulane has certainly been one of them. Temple has been one of them. Memphis has had a bit of a rough offseason with losing PJ Haggerty, and I feel like that conference is falling on some tough times. I think that it could be wide open for a team like South Florida to be able to rise up.
Yeah, and South Florida is in obviously a very weird sort of spot because their entire sort of trajectory last offseason sort of got flipped on its head and very unfortunate circumstances. But this is still a program that can bring in a lot of that Florida scrap, quote unquote, talent, and even just players in that southern area that maybe aren't getting the biggest of offers from the ACC, SEC, or Big 12 schools. And, to your point, the American is one of those kind of high arcing, mid-major conferences that does have a real legit powerhouse in Memphis and also a lot of money behind it and support from just a lot of these ADs. And for that reason, I think any one of these schools, if you kind of throw a dart in the middle, could all of a sudden just rise to the top, and whether that's a blip season or many seasons to come. And for that reason, I know a lot of people want to be out on Paul Mills. I guess I kind of understand it to an extent. It's been a little bit underwhelming so far, but Wichita State is still bringing in talent. They actually played a lot better near the back end of the season, and I wouldn't be, totally surprised if Paul Mills is all of a sudden back in that discussion of potentially getting an at-large bid.
No question about it. And I do think that it is going to be so interesting what we see out of a school like a Wichita State, who you mentioned under Paul Mills. And how do you evaluate some of these coaches that maybe they didn't get off to the world's greatest start? Because let's call it what it is. For Paul Mills, it has been a rough first two seasons for him. But that said, I felt like he didn't necessarily have his personnel all necessarily to his liking, especially year number 2 over at Wichita State. And I think that that's so big in evaluating these coaches. And sometimes I do feel like they get either too overrated or underrated based on what year 1 and year 2 really yields.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it how, for example, this is kind of an out of the woodwork sort of guy to point to, but a Jared Calhoun, who started at Youngstown State, the first couple of years, it was like, all right, well, this is probably going to be the same old Youngstown State that we're getting used to. And all of a sudden, they had a blow up year where they just absolutely rose to the surface of the Horizon League. And he was able to parlay that into a better job at Utah State, where in year 1, they started off fantastic. They made the NCAA tournament, and, things are looking up. I'm sure he's going to have a high trajectory in terms of his coaching, rise outside of just Utah State in the future. And I feel like that's one of those things you kind of got to key in on is not necessarily year 1, not necessarily year 2, but year 3 guys who have been winning at least to a marginal degree, maybe in lockstep with previous, regimes or just kind of coaches that have been at that program. But then in year 3, kind of propelling them a little bit further. And I mean, heck, we saw that with Patino at New Mexico. We've seen that with a number of guys at a number of different stops. And I don't think it's happenstance when you're talking about year 3, year 4 really being the prove it pivotal years, because you either get fired at that point or you get a new job at that point. And I think when you have a lot of coaches in that tier, you're going to have a lot of interesting sort of seasons play out.
Yep, you certainly are going to. And I mean, we saw it last year with Missouri. They went from over in the SEC to the NCAA tournament. They made the NCAA tournament in the first year as well. And I think that that is so interesting with these teams. And I think that year over year, the volatility and the amount of adjustment we need to make on these teams is at an all-time high, and I think that this is worth mentioning with Rob on the flip side. And additionally with Rob, I want to talk with him a little bit more about some of these young and hungry coaches. We're going to be talking about the Missouri Valley Conference. We're going to be talking about some of these higher mid-majors, for lack of a better term, and so much more on the flip side right here on Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Peterson, now a part of the Beats and Family Podcast. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Great to be rejoined by Rob Donaldson, who does great work with the show/podcast, Rob's Best Bets. You're able to check him out on youtube.com/Rob Donaldson for a lot of his video plays as well. And Rob, we were leaving off by talking about some of these teams with new coaches and them being so volatile in their first few years. How some of these teams, like we were talking about with Missouri, they go from over in the SEC tournament to making the NCAA tournament after they made it in that first year before they went over. And I think that leads to just such an interesting ordeal in college basketball where we need to be adjusting even more during the offseason on some of these teams because of the, shall we say, opportunity that the transfer portal both yields in terms of improving and yields in terms of going completely backwards.
Yeah, and I've come on here and we've talked about the portal nonstop throughout this entire summer and sort of springtime here as well. And the biggest part that I think we've continued to harp on is, longevity and building a program nowadays isn't about the 3, 4, and 5-year guys that you have on your roster that were built from the ground up. You recruited them from high school and they stuck around the program even when they were not getting playing time. And all of a sudden you have a developed guy who's making his first ever starts as a junior and senior in your program. Those days are long, long gone. Nowadays, it's like you have this player when he's actually playing well for a 2-year window, maybe at max. And it's about how do you capitalize on that 2-year window? How many guys can you actually have during that 2-year window that coincide with one another to formulate a really solid roster? I think that's what's going to sink a lot of these programs, unfortunately, but it's also going to really highlight a very hands-on athletic department buying into the head coach and just the head coach in general that can work with what he has and really attract more talent because of that. And again, I think there's going to be programs that sink. I think there's going to be programs that really flourish. And I think there's a number of those teams that you can already kind of identify in this NIL era.
Yep, no question about it. It's Rob Donaldson, who does great work with the show/podcast, Rob's Best Bets, joining me right here on Coast to Coast Soups. And obviously, you want to be taking a look at the incoming talent. But I think the biggest thing is, as Trilly Donovan, sometimes the best gets are the ones that are already on your roster. And I think that that's so big with everything as well, because I know you talked about it with looking at so many of these mid-major teams that bring back talent. And I think that those are the teams that can really yield a lot of fruit, not just overall during the season, but I think that's even more, shall we say, important towards the beginning part of the season, because when it comes to like February, March, if you have a team with a lot of camaraderie but not necessarily a ton of talent, I feel like the talent is going to be catching up with them just a little bit. But in November/December, these teams that are more experienced but maybe a little bit less talented, I think that they can really be the teams that creep up and win some games.
Absolutely. You're not only recruiting against other schools for the guys who hit the open market from not your school, right? You're recruiting to retain your players within your roster. I mean, Tom Izzo just got blindsided by one of his veteran guys saying, "You know what, coach, I appreciate the time and I appreciate you all developing me and whatever, but I'm bouncing to NC State. I want to play with Will Wade. They're willing to pay me more." And that's just the reality of the situation. Is yes, it's really nice when you can retain those pieces, and that's a luxury to have. And you really got to battle for your own guys, because if you're losing as many guys as you're bringing in, well, maybe that's a net negative. Maybe you're just kind of breaking even and you're going to be the exact same team. But I would kind of argue that if you don't have guys that are coming in that already know your system and you're losing just as many as you're bringing in, you're probably not better than before in a lot of those instances. And that's why I think the high majors definitely have an advantage, because they're already paying a lot of these guys and retaining a lot of these guys. But as we've seen, those players, whether or not you won a national championship, you're Florida, everything is great. You have players that are at the guard position, going to the NBA draft and so on. You have those depth pieces behind those guys who would have been theoretically starters next season saying, "Yep, I'm out, coach." And that's just the reality of college basketball, man. It's 2-year windows, a lot of roster turnover, and if you have the money to fork it out, that's a huge plus. But some way or another, you got to retain talent and you got to acquire talent in the portal.
And I'm so glad you mentioned that as well, because I think that's some of the biggest unpredictabilities, because you were talking about with regards to mid-majors, is these guys that they're at the power conference level, but they're averaging 1 to 2 points per game, and then they go down to the mid-major ranks. I'm not sure how you try to gauge that, but it feels like some of these guys, they just absolutely erupt. Like, I still remember a few years ago, Braden Podziemski, he was over at Illinois, couldn't see the floor, goes to Santa Clara, he's averaging like 18 points per game, he becomes a first-round pick of the Golden State Warriors, and then you have other guys where it's like, oh, he averaged 4 points per game at insert power conference school here, and he averages even fewer in like the Big South, and I think that that could sometimes be oh so maddening as well.
Yeah, and that's where I really do think that the programs and sort of the, I guess, best position for immediate growth are those higher level mid-major schools, whether you're in the American or the A10 or the Mountain West. I don't even know if you can, I guess, maybe count the Pac-12 in there at this point there too, but it's those schools and those programs that attract from both ends of the spectrum. You have up transfers wanting to go to your program, you have down transfers wanting to go down to your program to get more playing time, and you're not really like losing one direction or unilaterally gaining one direction. And that's where I feel like, that's the most opportunity for immediate growth, because you really do have the world as your oyster, so to speak. And you're in a league that maybe isn't going to be as much of a grind as the Big Ten or the SEC or the Big 12. And it's a matter of just capitalizing on that. We saw George Mason last year really take an elite level step, nearly got into the NCAA tournament by running that kind of structure. VCU as well. There's a number of schools that have really already gained from that formula, and I think we're going to see a continual build towards a very clear tier when you're talking about those types of schools.
Yep, I think so as well. And I'm so glad that you mentioned those teams that are sort of like the high mid-majors, because I look at the Missouri Valley Conference this season as one that could be very, very much one to be watching. They have a lot of teams like an Illinois State that bring back a lot of talent. A team like a Bradley is able to bring in some nice transfer pieces in the portal. Northern Iowa, a team that I know that you're very familiar with. Those are the teams I think can really be able to present a lot of value towards the early part of the season. And those are teams that they're sometimes a little bit out of sight, out of mind, because they're not at the power conference level. But those teams being able to bring back talent, I think, is really going to be big this upcoming season.
Yeah, and when you mention a conference like the MVC or the Mountain West or the A10, you not only have that talent pool of really good players who could play at a higher major, but maybe not get the same amount of playing time or opportunity, but you have really aspiring head coaches, which again, I view as a really big factor in terms of how willing and bought in are they going to be to elevate not only the program status, but their own status and really win games. And those conferences have them in abundance. I mean, Eric Henderson, you look at Drake, for example, and you look at the last three coaches that they've had, whether it's DeVries, who obviously had higher aspirations than just Drake after taking the West Virginia job and then going to Indiana in a 2-year span. But you had Ben McCollum, who went from, a Division II school up to Drake, then to Iowa in a 2-year span. And now you have a guy in Eric Henderson who's coming in from South Dakota State and obviously a very, very good coach, a very accomplished coach, taking over the mantle for two coaches prior to him that had a ton of success in the MVC. And I have to imagine he's probably got higher aspirations than just coaching in Des Moines, Iowa. And so I feel like that's a huge factor when you're talking about who are the schools going to be the most relevant. Even with roster turnover, even with head coaching regime turnover, I just feel like you key in on the guys who are the most motivated, most hungry, and maybe not just I don't want to single out like a Frank Martin or a Fran Dunphy, but maybe not the guys who have already had their time in the sun and are just kind of coaching out the rest of their careers essentially.
Yeah, to your point about LaSalle, man, under Frank Dunphy the last few years, it wasn't so amazing. And now that they bring in Darian Nichols, I do think that the arrow is trending northward, as the arrow always trends northward on this podcast. When you're aboard, Rob, you do such an incredible job. Take a look at this great game of college basketball this time of year. I know that you're doing an amazing job of being able to evaluate baseball and so much more. So let the good people at home know it's all in tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Well, hey, it's always a blast to talk ball with you, Greg, and I'm looking forward to doing it throughout the rest of the summer and into the fall. And for those who are wanting to follow my college basketball bets once that comes into frame, or wanting to follow my Major League Baseball bets, you can do so on my Twitter/X page at RobDFB, and also on my YouTube channel, which is just my name, Rob Donaldson. But as always, Greg, I appreciate having me on, man.
And it is always great to be able to get Rob aboard. He does such an amazing job. Take a look at this great game that we all know and love with college basketball. Every single time he joins me, he lends such great insights, and he did so once again today. So a big thanks to Rob for joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN family of podcasts. And if you do like what you're hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you do have one of two ways to be able to throw those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, Lord CM, naming does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And as always, great to be joined by Rob Donaldson. Make sure you check out his YouTube feed, youtube.com/Rob Donaldson, for all sorts of great videos. And make sure to keep this feed all refreshed, because I'm giving you guys a podcast every single day, regular season and off season. So I'll be back with you once again tomorrow. Thank you.